Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Near Memo, episode 155,000. No, it's 155. And we're here today with very special guest, Dana DiTomaso, who is the founder and lead instructor of the KickPoint playbook and a master of SEO and now GA4, which is going to be the bulk of what we're talking about today. And so welcome, Dana. Thank you very much for spending time with us and demystifying GA4.
Well, I can't promise I'm going to demystify GA4, but thank you for having me.
This is only a 30-minute podcast, Greg. This is.
I know there's not enough time, and
exactly.
Also, can anyone truly demystify GA4? I'm not entirely sure. So, yeah.
Well, or at least give people who have listened to this a somewhat better, a slightly incrementally better understanding of what's going on.
There we go.
Yes,
okay,
I will do that for sure.
Okay, so David, do you want to lead us in?
Yeah, sure. Well, so I was going to ask you, Dana, because I, prior to us connecting about you coming on the podcast, I guess I was only aware of one of your courses at the KickPoint playbook. So I don't know if you can just give, kind of a 2-minute summary of what those courses are about, how they differ, and just a little bit of background on, the development of those courses and what's in the curricula, I should say.
Yeah, for sure. So the two courses we have available right now are Analytics for Agencies and Practical GA4. Analytics for Agencies was the first course, and it is aimed at agencies, although we do have some in-house teams who take the course as well. And that is what we do at KickPoint, which is my agency, which is the other hat that I wear, president of KickPoint and co-founder. And that is what we do when we work with clients at KickPoint. It's all of our templates, all of our tools, our analytics plans, our default GTM container, how we set clients up start to finish on analytics. So that was for agencies where I would just get a lot of GA4s and analytics setups from agencies, be like, this is so bad. I just have to teach the agencies how to do this properly so that I don't have to clean it up anymore. And so that's what that course is aimed at. And it's essentially analytics in a box for agencies. Yeah. And then the other course is Practical GA4, and that is focused on someone who's been handed GA4 and told to figure it out. It's not your full-time job. It's something maybe you do off the side of your desk, as a part of being an accounts person or an in-house communicator or marketer. And so that takes you through GA4 start to finish. And I have a lot of use cases in there as well. Like, how do I report on blog post performance? How do I tell if people are clicking on this stuff? How do I know how many people go to the homepage and don't go any further? So I really try to focus on use cases, like common stuff that people ask us. And all the courses include a community access as well, where I can answer any questions that anybody has as specific as you want. And Analytics for Agencies includes a bi-weekly office hours, which is one-on-one time with me. Again, ask whatever you want. We had our office hours this morning and talked a lot about refer spam in GA4, which of course is a problem because spammers never sleep. So it's reared its head again in GA4 news. I thought we would be fine, but we're not fine.
Very good. Well, on the agency front, we'll start there since that was your first course. And then I'd love to hear more about some of the specific use cases that you get into, because I have a couple of my own that I'm struggling with. Even as a consultant. So what have you found that you mentioned, you work with agencies who are inheriting accounts that are such a mess, right? So what do you think though? What do you think most agencies get wrong with their sort of reporting framework, or what are they struggling the most with setting up, configuring GA4 on behalf of clients? What are some of your, top 2 or 3 things you help with?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I've spent the most time on lately is consent mode. So, of course, you may have heard that, people who sell to companies who are based in the European Economic Area or South Africa also has pretty strict privacy laws. You do have to have some consent management, and that means those little cookies. Do you accept cookie banners? And I think primarily, if you work in just the States, or I'm based in Canada, with the North American audience, you don't think about privacy controls in quite the same way. But there are some companies who are going to sell to European clients. And for those companies, you have to have consent management. And I have not seen a single consent management system set up correctly at all, no matter how big the company, like the largest of companies down to the tiniest of companies. No one's got it set up right the first time. And I think there's a confusion in terms of how these pieces work together with like the consent mode. What does GA4 get in? How do I control which cookies are set based on that? And then people were panicking about the third-party cookie depreciation. But when we're recording this, yesterday, Google said, never mind, we're just going to keep pushing this on down the line. We're not actually going to get rid of third-party cookies just yet. So I don't know. It's like Google's hoping if they keep procrastinating on it, we'll just forget that they said that they were going to do this after all, and then it'll be fine. It's I don't know what's going to happen.
I can interject here something that I think is relevant to what you just said, which is that there's a new sort of Privacy Act, which was long promised, but seemed like it was never going to come to fruition. A bipartisan, the known as in the U.S., not in Canada, the American Privacy Rights Act, which may become law, which will potentially create those same issues for marketers in the United States.
Yeah, and I think for sure American marketers or people working with just an American audience or Australian audience, Canadian audience, like you need to pay attention to what's happening in Europe, because really I think what's going to eventually happen is the default is going to be no tracking, and then you would opt into tracking. That is what privacy advocates want. Obviously, a lot of money to be lost with that, so people don't want that. But one of the things that I talk about, actually, my main topic of my talk at MozCon this year, which is happening in June, is on how little data we're actually capturing in our analytics. And I think that's one of the reasons why people are really struggling with GA4, because GA4 makes it more obvious that you're not capturing everything. UA kind of hit it in different ways, but in GA4, I find it's more obvious that you're not getting the whole picture as you used to be. And there's people saying no to cookies, and there's people who have ad blockers running all the time, and so they don't show up in analytics. And so nothing ever matches, and you're like, this tracking product is garbage. Well, no, it's just like the internet is garbage, and people don't follow nice, neat attribution paths. And so these are the things we have to take into consideration in our reporting.
Very good. Well, and we're well aware of what some of the gaps in GA4 have been kind of since the launch. What's kind of still there that's like, how have they not fixed this, whatever, a year plus or so after they turned off the better version?
Well, I would say the UI is still the most lacking. I think GA4 is a fantastic data collection tool. It is not a great reporting tool. And I think that if you are just using the GA4 interface to report, you're probably doing yourself a disservice. The exploration section is great, but also totally half-baked. There's a ton of features in there to make it more user-friendly that don't exist. So most of the time I just go to Looker Studio for my reporting for GA4. I don't do a lot in GA4 itself. There are the way to build that you can modify the reports menu, that you can change reports. I think those are all fantastic features and something that I would have loved to have seen in Universal Analytics. But again, it's just not there yet. And one of the things that I really try to hammer home with a lot of marketers is we love tables. Other people do not love tables. And so in Looker Studio, I try to focus on not tabular content when we're making reports for clients. But in GA4, it's all about tables all the time, which is not the best way to present data in a lot of cases. So, GA4 is good to go in there and be like diagnostic type reporting. Should it be what you're presenting to your CEO? No, definitely not. Like make something nice and pretty in Looker Studio instead, for sure.
And so do you, in either or both of your courses, is that sort of one of the main, vectors of discussion or direction is how to configure Looker Studio to pull in the right plumbing from GA4 and show what you should be showing to an executive?
Yeah, for sure. Analytics for Agencies has a very in-depth reporting section where I go through Looker Studio and how to do certain things. And it includes a reporting template in Looker Studio that you can copy and use for yourself. It's what we use with our clients, and it's a starting point. So the default template that we have has essentially everything you might possibly need, because it's easier to delete than add more things. Make a copy of that, delete anything you don't need, and off you go. In Practical GA4, I definitely cover reporting, and I end up in the use case section showing, I'm going to Looker Studio for this because this is why. So I think it's good for me in the use cases to go through and say, this is my thought process on why I'm reporting on this in Looker Studio, or in explorations, or in reports. And this is the limitations and features of each. And this is why, this ends up being the right option for this particular question. So I think that's one of the hard things to get your mind around with GA4 is I have this data, but where am I supposed to be reporting on it? And so hopefully with those use cases, that can help people understand like why, GA4 isn't the best use for this, or this is how you need to think ahead. And GA4 does require a lot of advanced planning. So for example, if you have everything's an event in GA4. And if you want to capture an extra piece of data along with that event, a parameter, and you want to show it in GA4, you got to register that as a custom dimension or custom metric. When you do that, it doesn't go back in the past. So you got to plan ahead and make sure that you're getting that data in there at the moment you set everything up. And that's just, again, like something that was more forgiving in Universal Analytics than it is in GA4.
Yeah. So you would your perspective is that the sort of setting up of those events still stinks, which has been one of my frustrations from the beginning.
Yep. I think the event-based model is fantastic, but I
Yep.
think it wasn't necessarily thought through for normal human beings.
Right.
It makes a ton of sense to analysts, you know,
Okay.
but there's the rest of us who have to use it, and not so
Right.
much for that.
Right. So that's what one of my questions was going to be, like, who do you think GA4 was designed for? Because I don't know of a single person in our world who thinks it's an improvement on universal analytics. What, like,
Analysts, they like
who are
it.
these analysts? What are these analysts analyzing? Right. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know, like, what their what part of the company do they operate in? What part of an enterprise would they operate in where the logic behind the user interface in GA4 actually applies to them? Like, I really don't understand.
Well,
like,
and
what
they don't use
their
the user
job role.
interface.
Yep.
Right? Like they're pushing this stuff out into BigQuery, and then they're doing stuff in BigQuery with the data. I think that that's truly what GA4 was built for. That is the ultimate use case, is exporting the data to BigQuery. I don't think they actually want people ultimately to use the user interface. That is not the goal of the team using GA4. And the other thing too that people should understand about GA4 is the GA4 team is part of the Google Ads team. They aren't their separate entity. So some of the choices that are made, for example, the weirdness of renaming conversions to key events unless it's something from Google Ads and then it's still a conversion, that is fully driven by the fact that the ads team was getting complaints from advertisers that the conversions weren't matching up between Google Ads and GA4. And they weren't, because there's like 3 different ways you could possibly report on a key event / conversion. And so now they've tidied that up for advertisers, but for the rest of us, well, too bad for you, you know?
Yeah. Go ahead, Greg. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wonder, you know, I've got AI on the brain these days with everything that's going on, and I just wonder whether there's hope for an improved, you know, interface, to David's point about the kludgy nature of the interface, through some sort of AI simplification. Or, you know, Google's got all this Vertex AI and Gemini and so on and so forth. Is there some possibility that Google could overlay that and you could just ask natural language questions and get answers?
I think that they're trying to do that with some of the insights items. I just don't know if it's there yet. And it's funny you should mention that, actually.
It is not. I mean, those things are just dreadful right now. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, I don't use the insights at all, except for like email alerts if suddenly something stopped working. But I actually just did a webinar with Andy Crestodina from Orbit Media, and we talked about using ChatGPT to analyze GA4 data. So it's funny you should mention that. So there's a replay of that on our website, actually, at kpplaybook.com, and go into the resources section. And that webinar was fantastic. Andy went through all the prompts he uses. And I find that for that kind of reporting, where you are asking those in-depth questions, going to an AI tool like ChatGPT is probably the way to go. And at least you can export your data pretty easily from GA4. So there's that.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. That's what I find myself doing. I mean, you know, certainly have Looker configured for sort of more ongoing reporting. But if I'm doing an SEO task, invariably, I'm just going into GA4, exporting it into CSV, and then looking at it behind the scenes. Even if it's something very simple like aggregating, you know, different sources across a subset of pages, like, you know, that's not something that I've actually figured out how to do in the interface. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's where it's, if you know you're going to be doing this, especially on a regular basis, like setting up those Looker Studio reports is the way to go, for sure.
Yep. And one of the nice things about Looker Studio, obviously, is you can sort of combine multiple data sources, right? So, I mean, you know, from the beginning, it's been a frustration for local marketers to have this sort of, you know, GBP data silo over here and the GSC data silo over here, and then the website data silo over here. And so is that, you know, obviously I assume that your templates combine those 3 sources for local folks, locally oriented folks. Are there other, you know, are there nuances there that you think people should kind of be aware of? Are there other sources that you think are super interesting or should be super interesting to local marketers?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is to make sure you're UTM tagging everything. And I think this is something that local marketers forget too. They're like, it'll be fine. Just, you have to UTM tag everything, period. And it's actually, there's a free GA4 course I put out on Bright Local, which goes through how to set up GA4 specifically, assuming you're a marketer working in local with maybe a couple of locations. Because the other thing that's really interesting is that if you do tag things well, you can use audiences a lot of the time to determine, especially if multiple locations. You could say, this is an audience of people who came to the site via this GPB profile. and for this location or this location, and create audiences and see, the Vancouver location converts better than the Calgary location, like what's happening between these two audiences, for example. And I think that audiences are one part of GA4 that people don't explore enough, but I think are really, really powerful, especially to compare things like, how are these two locations doing against each other? Or is this giant video the CEO wanted to put on our homepage, is it actually helping people convert? People who see the video versus people who don't, are they more likely to fill out a form? Or pardon me, not key event, not convert. Not that anyone's going to say like key eventing. It's not going to happen, Google.
Well,
good
maybe.
try.
I don't know. The word architect has always been a noun in my lifetime, and then in the last 5 years, it's now architecting. So maybe eventing is part of this trend.
I don't think anyone's going to be paying for Kiro, key event rate optimization anytime soon.
Right. Very good. Well, so the other question I had, sort of particularly around Looker Studio is, and I guess GA for Google Search Console specifically, is, man, I've really had a hard time. I work with a couple of, and I guess they're enterprise clients. They're large sort of health systems here in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm having such a hard time kind of getting the Search Console data to look anything close to GA4, because the Search Console data is so heavily sampled. And is that something that you've seen get worse, or am I just sort of waking up to this problem? Like what's going on? And do you have any tips for kind of reconciling that data a little bit more tightly?
Yeah, so a tool that we use is actually Branch Tools, which is made by 2 Octobers. And what they do is they export your Search Console data off to BigQuery and then make nice reports with it. But what they do is they actually pull things on a subdirectory by subdirectory basis. And so because they're doing those multiple pulls, you do end up with more data than you would get directly looking in Search Console. So they are pretty inexpensive. I do really like that tool. That's a good way to get started with it. And the default reports that they provide aren't bad if you want to start digging around in there.
Very cool. So it's 2 Octobers, and what was focused on Branch Tools? What was the name of it?
Branch Tools. Tools. Is the name of the product. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
And because they do local SEO as well, like they know what kinds of reports you're going to need. So there is some thought put into reporting from a local SEO perspective. But I think in general too, one of the things that I try to look at is if I'm comparing, how many clicks I'm seeing in Search Console versus how many organic sessions I'm seeing in GA4, I try to see if it's a consistent percentage difference. So it's always like 80% off, for example, and it doesn't really change all that much. And then I would know that, okay, well, this is just how much it is, and this is just how much it's going to be. But if it's varying a lot, then I would wonder if something's going on with my Search Console data or GA4 data. But I mean, again, people don't necessarily think about things like ad blockers, right? People use ad blockers, and you can't hide that you clicked on a link in Google because Google knows, even if you have an ad blocker, but you can hide from GA4 once you're on someone's website, for example. Or if you have consent management, again, like you could consent to being tracked on Google, but you turned off consent tracking on the website. So.
If you can't reconcile all these things, right, in your sort of methodology of trying to track a persistent difference, what do you believe, right? If you've got GBP analytics, you've got Search Console data, you've got GA4, where do you put your emphasis? How do you know which one to believe, or do you just kind of try and find some consensus?
Yeah, I think it's, you have to look at trends, not absolutes, and I think that's a big thing that people aren't doing enough of. And it's something where, for example, one of the big metrics I'm trying to push people towards is this, I don't know, I call it efficiency, but it's the idea that you're taking, all of your impressions from all your different networks and then dividing it by the number of conversions you get, for example, or the number of sales you had offline in store. And you can take any two metrics, it doesn't matter. So for example, if you're, Old Navy, they send out 80,000 emails a day. So, every 10 minutes. So it'd be the number of emails you send versus in-store sales, for example. Those numbers don't tie it together perfectly because no one's going to walk into the store and say, hey, I got your email, right? But they'll still go in and buy something. So if I send more emails, do the in-store purchases go up? Just like a simple metric like that can be a good comparison point. And something else that I'm really trying to get people to do is not think that the numbers are accurate. So one of the things that we're starting to do is like introducing a lot of rounding. So instead of saying that you had 21,746 visitors, we're going to say you had 21,700 visitors. That's it. And just like removing those points of precision that weren't actually precise because we don't know if that's true or not. It's just like, is the number going up and down? And so that's what I'm really trying to get people to focus less on, is the precision of the number and more looking at the trends of the numbers. Because, and again, I talk about this in my MozCon presentation, like, we aren't data accountants. And I think that that's where there's a lot of scrutiny put on to marketers that shouldn't be, for this level of precision, which frankly just is not possible. And you think you can try something like, we're going to do this server side tracking and we're still going to track people if they say no to cookies, like all the other stuff that people do to get around this stuff. Like, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, you can't track everything, except that you can't. And instead, focus on what the trends are telling you. You know, and so if something changes and it's like less than 10%, did it really matter? Probably not. But you look for those big swings instead.
Very interesting.
And how do you think? I mean, we talked about consent at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Google. We just saw that Google delayed the cookie deprecation again,
Mm-hmm.
but eventually it will happen. And you know, the privacy sandbox is designed to deal with that in an ads context. So as cookies sort of, you know, disappear and these metrics arguably become less reliable even than they are today, what is your general advice about looking at all these analytics for marketers? I mean, you just gave us some good advice with
Mm-hmm.
pay attention to the trends, but do you see further degradation of this going forward as cookies disappear?
Yeah, I think so. And I think this is where marketers really need to think about, how can I capture first party data? So, for example, like when people look at user metrics in GA4, they think that means a user. But the reality is that unless you have logins on your website and you're reporting those logins back to GA4, a user is just a device. You're not going to know I'm the same person on my desktop as I am on my mobile device. And so that cross device is just, it isn't happening, and it wasn't happening. And so I think really the users metric should be renamed the device metric, unless you're reporting users, then it actually is users. But there are ways to still report on first party data. So if someone fills out a form on your website, you can hash their email and save it. And if there's a way, if they click through to that email to, you know, come back to the website again, you could again do some encoding there to try to capture them and see them come across in multiple different ways. So there are some possibilities to do some work with first party data, and Google's actually opened up some of those options recently. They published some help articles on how to capture that kind of data and report it back as a user ID, like a pseudo ID, essentially to GA4. So I think that there are some possibilities there for marketers who have the budget and ability to do this. But, you know, for most, like a small business, it's not going to make sense for like that one location physiotherapist who has like 3 other people in his clinic, right? It's just not going to make any sense. So in that case, it's like, understand these are the limitations of your data. You know, it isn't going to be accurate because you don't have the budget, or it doesn't make sense. And so again, the reality is looking at the trends, not necessarily the absolutes. For the marketers that have the budget and time to try some of this first party stuff, great. And there's lots of really interesting stuff out there, especially the data importing features in GA4, where you can say import a, so for example, you fill out a form, you're on the KickPoint Playbook website, you're interested in a workshop, you fill out a form, we capture your Google Analytics 4 client ID. If you end up going ahead with us for a workshop, we then import that into GA4 with the value of how much your workshop was. So we can show the monetary value of that offline conversion. And so that's a feature that works really well in GA4 for those kinds of offline conversions. But again, you got to set it up and know you're capturing that stuff in advance.
But it's interesting that you're doing that in GA4 and not Looker Studio, for example.
Well, you can do it in Looker Studio too. You just have to blend. I mean, it doesn't really matter, like whatever final destination you have for this stuff. Like some of our clients, we do blends in BigQuery, and some of them, like we have a client who, when a form is filled out, we export it to a Google Sheet and they put a 1 or a 0 on whether or not they sold that lead. I don't care how you do it. Just, there could be a blend there for us because I'm here and I can do it. We import it into GA4. It doesn't necessarily work out well for everybody. So if there is some way to tie that together, great. But again, remember that you're only going to get the data for the people you could actually track. So if you have people who fill out forms or purchase something and you don't see that client ID show up, then that means that that person wasn't going to be tracked because of consent management, or they had an ad blocker running. And I would say even for us, like with all the tracking that we do on the playbook, only half of our sales actually show up in our GA4. And another half of those are attributed only to direct, because people are horrible and they don't keep UTMs in their URLs.
To what extent, though? I mean, this is all very complicated and requires a lot of sophistication. To what extent are are people really at risk of drawing the wrong conclusions from all of this? I mean, it sounds to me like if you don't really set it up correctly, if you don't
Mm-hmm.
exactly understand the limitations and you don't know how to respond to those, you could
Yeah.
draw completely incorrect conclusions from the data and act in ways that are contrary to your, to efficiency as you're describing.
Yeah, and
What's
I
the
think that was
risk of
totally
that, and
possible.
how do you guard against that?
I think that was totally possible in universal analytics too. Like, talk about bounce rate, the worst metric in the world that was never measuring and people thought it was measuring. And yet people's jobs and bonuses depending upon optimizing for bounce rate, and the same thing is happening now in GA4. I had somebody ask me, how can they increase engagement rate? Well, all you have to do is send an event called user engagement as soon as somebody loads up any page at all, and your engagement rate is going to be 100%. Congratulations, there's your bonus, right? So there's so many easy ways to game the data just generally. So I think part of it is that, yeah, of course you could have the data say whatever you want. Ultimately, at the end of the day, like, it's up to you if you're going to be honest or not about your data. But in terms of misinterpreting it, I think that that's where you do have to spend a bit of time educating yourself on what these things actually mean. But then also, speaking from like an agency perspective, the other half of it is educating your clients, or if you're working in house, educating your boss, and then also teaching them that like this data isn't accurate and this is why. So I think part of it is taking that time to really tell everyone else what's going on instead of just presenting a report and hoping that nobody asks too many questions about the data that's behind it.
I have one more question. I know we're basically at about our usual
Is there
time
a
here.
third party?
Go ahead, Mike.
I was curious if there is some alternative that agencies could use or small businesses could use that would be simpler, provide meaningful direction without any of the bullshit, overhead bullshit, Is there such a thing out there or not?
I mean, there are definitely analytics alternatives. A couple good ones are Matomo and Fathom are two that I really like. Fathom's actually made here in Vancouver Island, which is fun, local analytics provider. And Matomo's European-based, it's GDPR compliant. The problem that you're going to have and where these tools are going to fall down is in the integration with Google Ads. So if you're not doing any Google Ads at all, leaving GA4 behind, very simple. You can pick another tool, which you will have to pay for. Or you just be like, you know what, forget analytics. Or we just go back to, what was it originally, like web trends or something, which I'm sure is still around, where you're just looking at log files. Before we had Google Analytics, we still had analytics. And so you could definitely go back to one of those solutions as well. But if you're using Google Ads, you need to report on performance of Google Ads. It means that you're going to have to use a Google product in some way in order to report on what's happening with those ads. So that's something to keep in mind as well if you decide to go to another provider.
One of the things that I've discovered from talking to a lot of small businesses is that many of them, I mean, I think we get a distorted view of the world based on our relatively sophisticated client population. And the fact that they're working with agencies means that they're more sophisticated to begin with. But a lot of small businesses in the world that are using a lot of different marketing channels, certainly social media, some of them GBP, some of them are trying to do SEO, others are doing ads. They're using all kinds of things, 6, 7, 8 channels. They are not tracking the performance of those channels, and they only have a vague sense of what's working. And I had one business owner tell me, I'm busy, so what we're doing must be working, right? And they just really don't have any sense of whether the digital stuff is working or the traditional media that they're doing is working. And this is, I mean, I could just see these people sort of throwing up their hands because they're just too busy, too occupied with their day-to-day activities to really pay close attention. Even if they've got a dedicated person who's doing, blog posts or social media for them, that person is typically not sophisticated enough to provision these tools in the way that you're describing. And so it seems like a whole segment, to Mike's point, of the world, the bulk of the marketers in this marketplace are cut off from, practical use of these tools.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And it feels like how websites are now. Like websites, back when I started back in 2000 in the Stone Age, I made websites myself using Dreamweaver, right? And it was very simple to make a website. You could hand code it if you wanted still back then. And now, to set up anything other than, say, Squarespace or Wix, if you're going to go into WordPress, there's like all these files to do, and there's 80,000 things you have to think about. We have to think about, is it going to look good on mobile? Is it going to look good on desktop? What about speed scores? What about this, right? And the same thing is happening with analytics, where there's this true complexity to it now that didn't used to exist. And so I think the decision is more, what is the limit of what we know we can measure? And then again, if you're thinking about, one of my common metrics I look at is like, is this channel punching above or below its weight? What are the percentage, in terms of, if I look at the pie of people coming to the website as 100%, 60% are via organic, 20% are via social, 20% are via email, for example. And then if I look at the percentage of conversions, does the percentage of conversions out of 100 match up with that channel mix out of 100? And if it's wildly off, then something's not working in your marketing. And if it's not off, or if it's relatively close, then great, things are good. Keep doing what you're doing, And I think that can be a really simple measure that really any marketer could look at. I have a table in the default report that included analytics for agencies, and it's a pie chart in the middle of conversions, key events by channel, and then a donut around the outside of sessions by channel. And if those slices match up, great. And if they don't, great. And I do exactly the same thing for devices. Inner pie is devices breakdown, outer is sessions. And so again, if the slices don't match up, it means that maybe your mobile site is struggling at converting people. We should probably take a look at that. And so those kinds of really simple comparisons are easy for someone who isn't necessarily, analytics sophisticated to understand, because they can just look at it and see, does the color match? And then from a marketing perspective, you're showing like, are we doing a good job with the people that we can track? And I think that's one of the really critical features, is just like, we're not even looking at what the numbers are. We're just looking at whether or not these things matched up. And it really takes the conversation away from, well, you said that we had 36 form fills, but I see 42 form fills in my CRM. You must be a liar. And more like, are these channels actually performing somewhat as they should?
Awesome. Well, Dana, you just mentioned your one of your templates. Where should people go if they're really interested in seeing those templates and learning more about how they should be setting up their analytics and reporting?
Yeah, for sure. So my website is kpplaybook.com. We have the 2 courses available there. And if you use the coupon code Near Memo, you can get 20% off purchasing a course, and that will stack with team licenses as well. So if you want to buy it for 5 of your friends and pull together a license, you can totally do that. We also just introduced parity pricing. So if you're in a country other than the US that doesn't necessarily have great conversion rate against the US dollar, check out the parity pricing on our website. So for example, if you're in, I believe, India, it's 75% parity pricing. So we give you a 75% off coupon. So if you need to learn this stuff and you're in a country that doesn't have a great exchange rate against the US dollar, come talk to us. We want to make sure that everybody can learn regardless of the economic conditions of the country that you're living in.
That's awesome. Yeah.
And we'll put those links in the show notes, and that coupon code will allow us to track how effective we were in promoting
well, that's
your
part of it too.
courses.
Yeah. Because if you buy the course and you turned on your ad blocker, I can still see that you bought it. I can still see your coupon code. So that's everything old is new again. Coupon codes were one of the few ways that people could track online to offline conversions in the early days. And, we're coming back to that to some degree because of its simplicity. Yep. Well, and part of it too is I think that advertisers have kind of ruined the internet by trying to track everybody all the time. And so there's a reason why ad blockers exist, and that's because ads suck. If ads didn't suck, we wouldn't have ad blockers. And so I think this is a good way for people to realize that, maybe we're providing a crappy experience, and that's why we can't track everything. And it's time to get back to the basics.
All right. Well, then on that kind of upbeat and hopeful, practical note, thank you, Dana DiTomaso, for your insights and your practical advice about how to deal with GA4, the nightmare that is GA4, and other related kind of recommendations. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.